All right, I guess I'll start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abhishek Jain, and I'm pleased to invite you all to the first episode of Plant series on pursuing careers in public policy. Towards the end of this session, we will also be having a Q&A session, for which I would request you all to put your questions in the live chat box. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Udbhav Tiwari, a graduate of the 2017 batch from NUJS. He was previously served as a program manager at the Center for Internet Society, or CIS, and has also served as a public policy and government relations analyst at Google. He currently works as a public policy advisor at Mozilla. In this session, Udbhav will be speaking in detail on pursuing a career in public policy. I would now like to hand it over to Udbhav to begin the session.
Thank you so much for having me here and for giving me this opportunity to broadly talk about public policy in general, as well as specifically like the tech policy space. In terms of what I will be doing, I hope to spend like maybe approximately 30 minutes, and it might be a little under that, broadly trying to answer some of the questions that the team at Plan T has shared with me about like what are the sort of like items that they would like to cover and what would be most useful for people who are considering a career in the sector or are or even like are entering into a career in the sector. And post that, we can have a Q&A session. So I'd mostly like to start off by broadly firstly trying to answer what is definitely, I think, the most commonly asked question to me, which is what is the work of a public policy analyst, and what do you do in the public policy domain? And I think that in order to answer that question most usefully, it's very useful to look at public policy within the framework of law school, particularly because that's what the audience for this webinar is, but also outside of that. And I would say that in a vast majority of jobs that you would typically get outside of law school, whether it's in a law firm or as a litigator or in-house in a company, more often than not, when you're dealing with laws and regulations, you're dealing with them in a post facto manner. What that means is that the law is already out there, and a client either wants an opinion of how that law will impact a product or an action that they are taking, or it could be a reactive sort of scenario where you're defending a client for a breach of a law, or you're arguing for why somebody else has breached the law, and therefore your client has a remedy that the law can provide. Public policy is slightly different in that public policy usually starts much before that, where it's usually when a law is being designed and framed that most public policy like practitioners tend to be involved in the process, right? So that's not universally and uniformly true. For example, it is very often that when you're doing work, say for a product company, that you will be asked to help analyze the sort of political implications of a particular product, or even analyze what are the different ways in which a particular action by your company or your client can impact, will be impacted by ongoing regulation. But that more often than not, that's something that the legal team within any organization that you work with will usually be more qualified and better equipped to do than a public policy practitioner. So keeping that sort of distinction in mind, that more often than not, you are working on things that are about to become laws, or laws that are about to be amended to be made more modern or to be made more suitable to like societal developments, is where most of the work of a public policy analyst usually lies. And within that, I would like to say that there are approximately, I think, 5 things, right, that at least from my personal experience, one does in a public policy job. This is certainly influenced in particular by the technology sector, because that is where my experience is from. But it also applies to many other sectors that one would work in as well. And I'd like to spend some time sort of just talking about what those 5 components of a typical public policy job are, especially when you're working for a corporation, because again, that is where the majority of my experience has been. And those 5 parts, I would say, firstly are generally government relations. The second are industry relations. The third are relations with civil society, academia, and research. The fourth is proactive or positive partnerships. And the fifth is reactive product policy, right? And I'm going to sort of explain each of these five components in order to help illustrate what a typical public policy job is like. So starting off with the first one, which is government relations, more often than not, when you're doing public policy for any entity, whether it's a civil society organization or whether it's a company, you are more often than or not the face of that company when it comes to the government, right? Now, the word government here for the tech sector, for example, can mean officials within the IT ministry, officials within the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, or many other sort of departments like the Department of Telecommunications, like the Niti Aayog, that all sort of interface with technology. But this can be extended to say that, for example, if you're working in health policy, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare is likely going to be one of the ministries that you deal with. And your goal in this government relations paradigm is largely to build relationships with these individuals in a manner that you understand their priorities and their intent behind legislation, and B, that if there is a scenario that requires communicating with them, either because there is a new law that is coming out, or if there isn't a new law coming out and there is, say, a mishap that has recently happened within your organization, and the government wants to ask you some questions about, like, why did this occur? What are the steps that you're taking to mitigate the harm, if any, that may be occurring? Are all things that having this relationship with your government stakeholder is usually incredibly helpful for. So because of that, similar to how one would expect lawyers in a litigating firm or in to sort of have an awareness about who different judges are, and what their different personalities may be, like what different strategies one must adopt before particular judges. Of course, while acknowledging that the separation of sort of between lawyers and judges is of a far higher degree and is a much more sort of sacrosanct relationship, is very similar to what happens in the public policy space when it comes to government relations and having relationships and understanding the priorities of government officials and regulators who are attempting to sort of craft regulation for a particular space. The second is industry relations. So this term industry relations, of course, is specific to jobs that one would typically do inside a company, but also applies to research and civil society as well, where more often than not, you will very rarely be doing public policy that only impacts your organization. There will be many organizations that work on particular issues and organizations that are impacted by such regulations. So most of these organizations tend to come together and band together for particular like causes, right? Now, some of them are high-level associations like industry associations. So there are industry associations like FICCI, like IMAI, like CII, and a bunch of others, some of which are general industry associations and some of which are specific to sectors like IMAIs for the technology sector. And these industry relations play a very important role in making sure that your peers in your sort of sector and industry are also aligned towards the policy positions you take. And this can often be a fair bit of work because you have to make sure that different companies have different products, different services, and you have to align their interests in a manner that they can arrive at a common consensus for what the industry's position on a particular law should be. I would say that more often than not that this actually does end up taking place. Like it's not uncommon, but it's definitely the exception and not the norm that industry associations cannot arrive at consensus on a particular policy issue. There are some instances which have been recorded in the public domain where this has happened in the past, such as the issue of data localization and data protection is a place where certain Indian industry players have a different position from what international technology companies usually tend to have, and that's definitely something that's played out in the public domain. But providing a platform for this conversation to take place and allowing for it to be something that can be constructive and at the end of the day helps the government understand what the impact of possible policy positions would be. Looking at the policy objectives behind regulations as an industry and providing alternatives that could achieve those same policy objectives are all things that one does as a part of industry relations along with your peers. The third, like I said, was relationships with civil society, academia, and research. More often than not, when you're working in the public policy field, you as an individual are quite often involved in the granular sort of like day-to-day operations of your organization, whatever sort of category it may fall under. And it therefore becomes very important to be able to make sure that those organizations are in touch with the latest developments in the field, where if there is new research that is taking place, either technical or policy research, that you are aware of the organizations that produce that research. You're aware of like the thought leaders in the space so that you can understand what the broader public consensus or one would say like the consensus that one often sees develop in the op-ed pages of newspapers, for example, is a perfect example of why having relationships with those stakeholders is incredibly important in order to be able to understand how the wind is blowing, how certain issues are broadly being perceived, but also because more often than not, like you can also help in that process. One could help in that process by inputting in to the overall sort of information that is available. So, for example, if there is misinformation about a particular product feature or just confusion about whether something works in a particular way or not, the public policy team quite often sort of like will draft up talking points and explain them to certain important members of the public or what are usually known as key opinion formers, so that there is so the facts are out there and then people know the information that they have to adopt. And this is something that happens quite sort of openly as well. But apart from that, there are many other ways in which these relationships work. Sometimes they work with regard to funding, where if there are common interests between you as a public policy organization and another, like either individual or an organization, then you can do joint collaborations on research projects. You can fund projects at other organizations, and all of these are essentially different ways of making sure, strategically speaking, that that you play a role in the public discourse that is created around a particular topic. The fourth is proactive, positive partnerships, which is essentially making sure that when you are a public policy individual, one of your key things is to make sure that you don't really get in touch with the government only when something is bad, or in an adversarial manner, or when only getting in touch with them when there is a new law coming out and you want them to sort of like listen to you, right? It makes much more sense for there to be long-term aligned interests with government stakeholders in a manner that like also lets the government benefit from the knowledge and the information and the reach that is present inside many of these companies. So striking out proactive, positive partnerships, which are partnerships that you strike with government stakeholders and with civil society stakeholders and with industry stakeholders that aren't just about laws and regulations, right? Like, so for example, if you realize that financial frauds are increasing, then you as a company can come together and create a coalition that says, we will now help improve public awareness of financial frauds in the country. And this could be pooling in resources to run advertising campaigns. This could be spreading awareness via curricula in school and in colleges. And it could be even extending as much as even working with the government and ministries such as the Consumer Protection Ministry in order to make sure that there are helplines set up and there are resources available to people to be able to mitigate the harms that they are facing because of either a lack of information or just because technology moves so quickly. So that's what positive partnerships are, which are striking, like leveraging both your internal resources as well as the resources and scale of the government to generally do things that are not just better for society, but also allow you to be able to have a positive impact on because of your company's like sort of resources on the world at large. And finally, like I said, is reactive public policy. So reactive product policy, which is whenever the company itself is creating a new product or is creating a new feature, public policy teams tend to be very integrally involved along with legal and public relations teams in assessing that product or that feature, right? What is the possible impact it's going to have on the world at large? Like, how is it going to impact with laws and regulations? Are there going to be political ramifications? Are there changes and tweaks that should be made to make it more acclimatized to the Indian environment or the Indian political milieu? All of these are things that internal teams do as well. So that like with this, I hope to have sort of broadly given an overview of like government relations, industry relations, relationships with academia, civil society, proactive, positive partnerships, and finally reactive product policy. And this broadly, I would say, covers about between 80 to 90% of the kind of work that you would do in a typical organization when you are a part of their public policy team. And then the next question that like I was told I could cover is like broadly how and when should one apply for a job, right? And I think to that question, there are a couple of answers. It mostly depends on the kind of job that you want. Almost overwhelmingly, and there are very few exceptions, public teams within technology companies and even otherwise very rarely tend to hire people right out of law school, right? Like they almost always require at least a little experience in the field before they hire them. And that's usually because public policy teams are remarkably small. Some of the largest corporations in the world have public policy teams that are just between 300 to 400 people for the entire world. And in countries like India, public policy teams are often just between 5 to 10 people, even for the largest players. And for smaller players, they're just like 2 to 3 people working on public policy and government relations, where there are some exceptions. But by and large, like public policy teams tend to be smaller than both legal as well as public relations teams within companies, and which is why they place a premium on experience, because there is very little sort of overall scope available within these companies to train fresh resources and acclimatize them to the public policy environment. Because of that, I would say that like the trajectory that many people in India have taken so far, and even all over the world, to enter the public policy space is that they first enter a space if they want to necessarily work in the corporate space, which is no means the only rewarding thing to do in public policy. There are so many like equally rewarding, if not more rewarding, things that the space offers you. Tend to start off in either research organizations such as civil society or organizations or think tanks, or tend to start off with fellowships, right? So there are some people who apply for fellowships like the LAMP fellowships. There are other fellowships that let you work very closely with parliamentarians, and some people even directly just work for the offices of these individuals. And then there are also other kind of opportunities available, whether it's internships or sort of like short-term consulting projects, or even full-time jobs in organizations that engage with this space and do so at a relatively like granular and intellectual level as well. The usual benefit of this is that it is a fairly good way to sort of pace yourself into that space to discover whether it's something that you really like to do without necessarily being thrust into like the sort of like give and take of like the policy circuit, which can move pretty quickly. And it also gives you the benefit of sort of like actually being something that like is where most of your peers who are entering that space will usually enter at as well. For example, like a tangible number of people who work at the technology policy teams of some of the biggest organizations in India that have policy teams are from civil society and research organizations initially, and then sort of transition into these roles. Like less than 50% or 40% for sure, but like it's still a reasonably tangible number. And it's not like everybody goes to civil society and then moves to companies. That's just not the case. Many people continue with civil society and research because it is in and of itself a very rewarding activity. But otherwise, like I think there are many people who sort of choose to take that route or have just naturally taken that route because that's where companies tend to hire from. And in terms of when most people should start doing a lot of this stuff, I would say that like the third, fourth, and fifth year of law school is broadly a good time, just like with all other careers, to work towards this, where spending third year and fourth year interning at a variety of these places. Most technology policy companies, for example, and companies otherwise as well, don't take interns in the public policy space because of the same constraints I described earlier. So many of them intern at research organizations, some intern with members of parliament, and gain some experience, and then spend fourth year doing their return internships and fifth year applying for jobs as and when they become available, and sort of working at them. So that hopefully answers the how and when to apply for such jobs when you're in law school. When it's, however, I would like to reiterate that if your interest is working in a company, more often than not, the wiser thing to do is to not apply to a company right when you're in law school, because more often than not, you would be not accepted, but to get legitimate experience elsewhere and then apply into these jobs so that you can help demonstrate that you have an understanding of who the stakeholders in the space are, what its dynamics are, what its top issues are, what are the different positions that different groups and factions within the space have taken on particular issues, and showcase value of how you could strategically help improve that. The next question that I was told to ask, like said I could cover possibly, is what could one do in law school to improve their chances of getting such a job? And to that I would say a couple of things, right? Like the first is experience. It's very, very important to actively go out there and do internships and experience the field as a whole. Many people have like an impression that the of the field without necessarily having like practiced in the field itself, and because of that, I think like the earlier you do your internships in law school and the more you see how these organizations work, the better it is going to be for you, in terms of you will make a more informed choice about your whether firstly this is a career you want to pursue, but also what are the steps that you can take within that career in order to be actually good and successful at it. The other things would definitely be that like the public policy space in general, technology policy space also is actually full of self-starters, right? Like there is no real like tech policy course per se that is compulsory in law schools, and there are optional courses that are offered all over India in law schools now in technology policy, but it's still a sort of 50-50 in terms of how widely available they are. So because of that, I think it's really important to make sure that in order to improve one's chances of doing really well at the field, it's important to sort of like read the right news sources, read the right books, track the developments in a space in a sort of intrinsic manner. And there are different sort of like, for example, in India, there is the website Medianama that I would highly recommend for tracking technology policy things. In America, there are many websites, but like The Information, The Verge, Wired are some that I would highly recommend from covering developments that are taking place internationally in technology policy as well. And the third that I would definitely say is technology policy and policy in general is definitely a place that is very heavily dependent on networking and public speaking as well. So sort of like gaining public speaking experience, making sure that you're at the right events and at the right places where there are people who can so that you can meet and interact with the people who sort of are the main players in the field is remarkably helpful. This is obviously something that with the ongoing pandemic has not really happened through the course of 2020 and probably will not happen for most of 2021 as well. But I personally do envisage a return to that overall dynamic in sometime in 2022 and going forward, and that because that was certainly the case before. And at the end of the day, this is a space that is very heavily dependent on relationships and reputation. So the more you do that, the more you expose yourself to it, I think the better the one's odds are of succeeding in it. What has my experience been as a public policy lead was also something that I could cover. And so far, it's definitely been an incredibly rewarding space. One of the things that I like quite a lot about public policy is the fact that it's in terms of like the evolutions and changes that take place, it's at the tip of like the spear of most sort of developments, and therefore it's much more dynamic where laws don't change. Laws are always changing all the time because you're actually helping them change, and it's just a more dynamic space than many other parts of the legal profession. For me personally, like, and that's not at all to say that like the legal profession isn't dynamic because you do 20 new things every day in most roles in the legal profession. But in the areas that one is interested in, and the fact that more often than not, that you are trying to create laws for areas where no one has made a law before, right? Or even if they have made a law, no one has ever made a law for that in India before, or for many, many countries in the world before, is certainly a very interesting intellectual challenge. And that has personally for me been the most sort of rewarding experience. And but apart from that, it's definitely a place that I think there is a ton of potential for, is growing quite massively. And I think that like the number of people pursuing public policy in general is only going to increase every year as and when regulations and laws get more and more complex. Excuse me. And the experience, and I think it will, all of this like in combined has led to definitely be a very rewarding experience for me personally, and it's something that I would quite highly recommend for most people if they are interested in like helping create and craft laws and regulations, or otherwise just helping shape what I personally think like are some of the most sort of important questions of our time in terms of how technology should interface with our lives and where we should essentially draw the line. In terms of like any other insights about pursuing a career in public policy, I would definitely say that like it's a nascent field. It's evolving and growing very quickly. So many of the things that I'm saying right now may not be like I would say like my top 5, for example, of the things that I've said so far may not even be the same 3 years from now or 4 years from now because of how the space will grow, evolve. So it's a very dynamic space. I would say that it's very important to be well read, to keep your pulse on what the changes are in the ecosystem and to keep adapting to them. And I would also otherwise very highly recommend making sure that when you do enter into the space, one realizes that like while the space is definitely nascent, it is also like a reasonably competitive space, just like any other space, I think, and does have like people who are incredibly skilled and are great at what they do, and generally like your peers in the public policy sector, at least in the tech policy sector, from what I can speak to, are peers you can learn from and grow along with, and in so many ways. So that's just another additional insight that I would add for why it's an interesting idea to pursue a career in public policy. Some other questions that I thought I could very quickly cover. The first is, how is a career in public policy different from other career options post an LLB? I think I've sort of answered that question a little bit with regard to like the fact that you are more often than not like helping craft regulations rather than understand and enforce them, and that requires a different kind of thinking. And your training and one's training as a lawyer is helpful in that. The second is that like understanding that unlike many things that lawyers do, like in law firms or in litigation, you don't have to have a legal degree to do public policy. The vast majority of people in senior positions in public policy in India right now are either journalists or have never been trained as lawyers. So, and even now, I would say that number in that ratio is certainly increasing. Like, I think in most public policy teams now, like you probably would find between like 50 to 60% of the team being lawyers, but the other 40 to 50%, if not more, are not lawyers in a public policy team. And there is a lot of utility to that, like because it demonstrates that the public policy space, the skill sets it requires don't necessarily like or aren't necessarily just limited to things that law school teaches you, right? And because of that, this is, I would say, is largely a pro, because this means your peer circles aren't all just lawyers who have studied the same thing, but come from very diverse backgrounds and sectors, like from public administration to engineering to MBAs to like just a ton of degrees. And public policy is just the thing that they're doing right now. And they are like, in terms of cons, like it's definitely not a con, I would say, but it does mean that like you have to differentiate yourself like at a threshold above just being another lawyer in order to sort of like do your to go about doing what you're doing. The second sort of different from other career options is more often than not pursuing a career in the legal profession in India, which is not this is by no means a universal truth, but like it is quite jurisdiction specific, which means your work is largely work that you can only do in India because of and that's true for like legal qualifications in many places. Of course, people get training contracts and work for research organizations all over the world. So what I'm saying is not by any means like a gospel truth. It's at best a vague generalization. But the public policy space, on the other hand, is more sort of like dynamic and sort of like cross-sectoral in that way that like you can do public policy for other jurisdictions based out of India. You can do work based on your understanding, because how things that happen in India like influence much of the global south and the developing world as it's put. So and because of all of those reasons, I would say that like it's a career that if you're interested in moving abroad, if you like a lot of travel, and if you like a lot of these other things from an international perspective, the career in public policy can quite often provide you that, and almost certainly provide you that with like at a younger age and with less, and there are more opportunities to do those things than in the legal profession, where thanks to the sheer number of people in it, and because of the fact that it's a far more like organized and infinitely larger sector, are usually available to people after much more experience. And finally, like, I mean, if there are any general tips or myths that I would like to bust, and like, I don't think there's any myth in particular that I'd like to cover, because I think I've sort of like caveated and said enough explanations in my talk so far. In terms of other general tips, I would like just very strongly recommend people to like consider the field. It's a field that has an incredibly high impact on the world and society around you. You like deal with issues that are making front pages of headlines every day, like no matter which sector in public policy you're working on. It's one where if like things like power and privilege and like broadly like being a part of like politics interests you, but one doesn't want to get into politics per se, public policy is a good way to like to engage in an intellectual aspect of a very similar thrill as well, which is some people may find attractive. And in general, it's a space that I think, because I mentioned it's growing as fast as it is, I would definitely recommend as many people try as possible, because it is, at the end of the day, I think one of the most sort of like useful things that law school teaches you is how to think like a lawyer. And I would say that, like, in order to be a good public policy professional, that's an incredible asset to have. So it's a really good way to leverage your training and skill sets from law school as well. But even if you're not from law school, like I said, there are so many people who do public policy who are not even trained as lawyers at all. So I would certainly recommend even people like who aren't like necessarily like doing great in law school, for example, grade wise or things like that, to definitely keep considering the space, because it does give you tremendous amounts of opportunities to showcase your talents over a period of time and to make the most of them. So yeah, that's just my sort of like 32 odd minute overview of the space so far. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Thanks a lot, Udbhav. I think that was a very informative session, and it has definitely opened us up to a new possible career after finishing an LLB degree. So thank you for that. We do have a couple of questions actually. So I think my first question is actually going to be with respect to something that you mentioned. So you said that it is essential for a lawyer to actually be able to distinguish themselves from just about any other lawyer when they're trying to actually show that they're a good candidate for pursuing a career in public policy. So how far do you think that things like an MPP, a Master's in Public Policy, or an MPA would do that? And also, are there any other ways of trying to create that distinction?
I would say that the average age, for example, for the MPP degree at the Harvard Kennedy School is 31 years old or 32 years old, depending on which batch you're talking about, right? So all of that to generally illustrate that most people who do public policy, at least a master's in public policy, do it after some experience, similar to the earlier illustration that I'd given about the job. And that's largely because it's a profession which has like a long sort of like incubation period in terms of skills and in terms of like your understanding of the space, which is why I would say that like there are many people who like, you know, finish law school or other schools, go to a MPP or an MPA, public policy, public administration for the PP and the PA, and then come back and work in the technology sector or other policy sectors. But I would say that they are the exception. The norm is certainly people working for 3 to 4 years, then doing their master's degree, and then either coming back to the sector or leveraging the master's degree to sort of like expand the scope of their work, either geographically, which is doing international work, or sometimes even switching fields within the public policy sector. And this is true not just for the tech space, but it's also true for health policy, for education policy, for finance policy, and a bunch of other things. So I would say it's a useful degree to have, and it's something that like many career professionals get, but most of them get it after some work experience, and it's by no means like absolutely necessary in order to be able to sort of like run teams or lead. Like, for example, most of the people who lead public policy teams, I think from in India, from the biggest teams, don't really have like a MPP or an MPA degree. Some do, but most don't. And in terms of what are the other things that one can do to distinguish themselves, I covered some parts of it in my initial talk, which is like make sure that you are out there, that you meet, like that you are attending the right events. The pandemic has been a little bit of a blessing in that regard, in that like things have been moving online more and more and have become more accessible to the public, which one can take advantage of. And also make sure that whenever you are engaging with the space, that you're always sort of like differentiating yourself, right? Like that if you're just another lawyer who analyzes another piece of legislation or provides the same strategic insight that anyone can get like by reading an article in a newspaper, then like the odds are that you will do well in the space, but that you will not stand out. So whether it's by having or demonstrating an interest in the technology itself and understanding technology well, or it's whether it's specializing in one or two domains, but having in-depth knowledge about them, like some sort of focus and specialization, I believe is one of the best ways to distinguish yourself, apart from making sure that like you are present at the right places at the right time to the best of your ability. To be able to leverage the opportunities that are present in this space. Then this is definitely, like I would say, both an elitist and an exclusionary answer as well, because of the nature of the space, its size, its overall dynamics are definitely one that don't lend themselves very well to very important things like diversity and otherwise just like making sure that as many people feel included as possible. But that's something that I think the space is grappling with more and more, and hopefully is moving towards the better as well. So there are allies and friends and opportunities available for people who may not necessarily come from the place of privilege required to do some of these things. And I would definitely encourage people to sort of like make use of them as well as they can, even if it's just like messaging people and just reaching out to them to ask for help.
Yep, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it does definitely put a lot of things into context with respect to not only pursuing a career in public policy, but also with respect to a lot of these master programs. So thanks for that. Next, I actually have a very, very interesting question, because I want to understand how exactly do you compare the workload or the stress in a public policy internship with, let's say, a corporate law internship or a litigation internship or just about any other internship that you would do at law school. And the same also with respect to a career that you end up pursuing in public policy.
I would say overall, when it comes to like stress and workload, there are different kinds of stresses, right? I would say that the general legal profession certainly has longer hours than the general public policy profession. Like, I mean, most people I know in the legal profession work like between 60 to 70-hour weeks, right? And I know people who've done 80-hour weeks as well, like on a semi-regular basis in like bad crunch times in their careers. And I would say that the public policy domain isn't necessarily like that. And that's largely because public policy as a field is also much more strategic, right? Like if you are like, it doesn't necessarily require as much sort of like rote work that the legal profession can require of individuals, and it is also one where like you are expected to be strategic and agile in your thinking, and that necessarily requires like, I think, operating in a very different way to what an average legal sort of career would require, either in a law firm or in the litigation circuit. So I would say that in terms of the work hours are certainly better, but I wouldn't necessarily say that like about the stress, because the thing is that the public policy sector, because of the fact that it's small, because of the fact that like it gives more responsibility to people with lesser experience than the legal sector does at the end of the day, it definitely can be more stressful for individuals because the consequences for your actions can be very tangible, and like you getting something wrong could mean a newspaper headline tomorrow, depending on like what you got wrong, which is something that like can cause a lot of stress to people. And also otherwise, like it can be a fairly high energy space where like things move very, very quickly. Something that I sort of realized, especially from my time in working in a tech company, is like lawyers are really good at and are trained to think, to give advice, to like advise on like anything under the sun, but we're not very great at implementation. We're not very great at execution, and that is something that one fundamentally does in the public policy space. One has to be good at not just coming up with a great idea, but like coordinating among a multitude of internal teams and external stakeholders to execute projects at a very, very fast pace. That gap between thinking and ideation and implementation and execution is a very sharp, I would say, learning curve within the public policy space, and is one that in some ways I am still like learning to do as a part of my profession. So things like that can definitely be a cause for both like a lot of self-introspection and stress in the space. So I would say the stress can go up and down, but like the hours usually tend to be a little more sensible. And in general, the space, because it's smaller and operates at a more strategic level, just has a different work profile to many of the things that one typically does in a legal career, which tend to be like much more procedural and sort of like granular and organized.
All right, I think that definitely answers the question. My next question is actually something you did talk a little bit about, and you also spoke about the importance of doing an internship with, let's say, a think tank or a policy tank if you want to actually pursue a career in public policy. But what I actually want to ask you is that how exactly do you think a first timer, that's a student who's not done any internships in this field, should go about looking for these internships? And secondly, also successfully getting these internships?
Sure. I mean, I would say that most like, so for example, the first time I applied for an internship in the tech policy space, like I didn't have any tech policy per se experience either. Most people I know definitely start off at a time at which they don't have that experience. So the first thing is to not feel too worried about that, to say to take a deep breath and realize that everyone starts somewhere and that it's okay. And the second is that the criteria by which most policy think tanks and civil society organizations will take you is your writing. So anything that one can do to improve their writing, they must and should do. So most places will ask you for at least a 1,500 to 2,000 word writing sample of work that you have done. They would prefer it to be in the technology policy space, but and which could be something that, a paper that you just write over the course of a week. And only for that internship, or it could even be things that you've otherwise written in law school that you can tweak as a writing sample. So I would say that apart from that, the usual things that one is taught in law school, right? Like making sure that your CV is good, that you have a concise cover letter that explains why you want to do what you want to do, that you have a good a CV that showcases, if possible, some interest in the space, but even if not some interest, at least a willingness to be a curious individual that has the capability to sort of learn a new thing if they want to. So whatever you can do to do those things as a part of an application process all really help. And I would also say that unlike many other spaces, public policy internships tend to not be as grade sensitive as say a law firm internship, because the skill sets that are required are quite different, and necessarily being good or bad at grades in law school does not automatically mean that you're good or bad at public policy. It does mean that I think that you have certain skill sets that are helpful in the policy space. So if you have good grades, please do leverage them. But even if you don't be disheartened. Just make sure that you bump up the other things on the writing front, on the public speaking front, and on the understanding technology front, so that it comes through in your application that you are genuinely interested in the field. And most of these organizations, in terms of how to get those internships, put this stuff up online. It's no matter what organization it is, talking to peers in law school will help you usually find out that list. But even just googling technology policy research organizations in India will give you a fairly indicative list in the first 2 or 3 pages in Google. And then making sure you talk to people about the organizations, their work culture, the work they do, the availability of internships and which projects you will intern under. So taking an informed call and applying via their online internship processes is usually more than enough.
Yep, I think that definitely helps. I think that probably brings me to the last question for the Q&A series. So one of the very, things that we all get into law school with is a very restricted mindset of the possible things we could do with a 5-year or a 3-year law degree. So what I actually want you to comment upon is, what exactly do you see as the scope of actually pursuing careers in public policy, both in India and also outside? And do you really think that, people should actually start seeing this as a viable alternative to, let's say, careers at litigation or as a corp law firm, a lawyer or something of that sort?
I think that the answer depends completely on how much you want it, right? And what I mean is, there will never be, I think, as many public policy jobs as there are corporate lawyer jobs, or as there are litigation jobs, right? And that's because those jobs serve a very core function in society, and there's a particular demand for them. To give you an example, I think that there are probably between 300, and that's a stretch, but there are probably between 300 to 400 people who do tech policy in India, right? That's it. Holistically, research organizations, companies, people in the media, people in the government, if I draw a very holistic, large circle, it's actually a very, very small space. A medium-sized tier 1 law firm has 500,000 people, right? So that's how small, and I'm now talking about the whole space versus one firm. So from the possibility of the number of jobs available, it will almost always certainly be not, I wouldn't say easier, but there will be more jobs available in traditional legal careers for people who are traditionally coming out of law school than there will be in the public policy space. And that's just the way the space is. But I don't think that's a bad thing, right? I think in order for something to be a viable alternative career, one needs to look at does the place where you study give you the skill set to do well at it? Does the place where you study give you the networks required to understand the space and build relationships with the people who are doing it? And more importantly, like, is it something that truly drives you and you find interesting? For all three of those careers, I would say for some time now, technology policy has been a very valid alternative career option. And I would say, like, even calling it an alternative career option, like, I think, like, within the broader school, like, narrative of law school reinforces that, like, traditional things lawyers do and untraditional things that lawyers do. And I think that, like, the more the people break that, the more one realizes that law school at the end of the day is a way that essentially teaches you to think like a lawyer, and the value and the utility of that far exceed the value and utility that is necessarily only present in jobs in the legal profession. So it's definitely, I would say, a valid alternative career option. Its potential is only going to grow. Its scope is only going to grow. And despite the fact that there will always be more traditional legal jobs available, I think anyone who's interested and can showcase that they're good at public policy will always have something waiting for them in the profession. And that's largely because it's of the growth and the scope of like just how much there is to do already and how much more there will be to do in the near future in the space in India and all over the world.
Okay, I mean, I definitely think it's really, really good to know that it's actually something that we should definitely consider at the end of our 5 years. It's really, really comforting to know that there are actually more options. So thanks a lot. And Udbhav, really thanks a lot to actually take the time out to actually educate all the law students and graduates out there about opportunities in this new space, in this new and upcoming space. So I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you once again on behalf of Team Plant.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure, and for like both the team at Plant and as well as like elsewhere. If there's any way in which I can be of help, like, I mean, I'm available like I'm on Twitter and I'm on LinkedIn. Like, I'm more than happy to sort of like help people, like help answer any questions that anyone may have, and just generally like make sure that like the barriers to entry that currently exist in this space are like whatever small part I can play in lowering them, I do. So please, like, to both y'all and as well as anyone who sees this, please feel free to reach out as well.
For sure. Thanks a lot, Udbhav.
Thank you so much.